All right, thanks for your patience. So to start off, I thought I'd share just a little bit about my involvement with this project. I actually grew up just south of you in the town of Irvine in Southern California. And so growing up, I really had a very limited concept of what a prairie ecosystem is. I'd been exposed to things like Little House on the Prairie, of course, and I sort of had in my imagination this image of the cultivated Midwest, cornfields, wheat fields, areas that were not particularly wild in my imagination. So when I moved to Montana in 2007 and became involved with this project, I was really surprised to learn how ecologically and geographically diverse the American Prairie Reserve in the Montana Great Plains actually is. Not only is it just a stunning region in terms of scenery like this photo here, but it's also home to some of our nation's most interesting and in many cases, most imperiled wildlife. So before we dive into the project itself, I thought I'd share something that really surprised me when I started working with the reserve. Worldwide, less than 5% of temperate grasslands are under any form of protection. And the reason that grasslands are so imperiled largely has to do with human migration. Wherever we as humans went around the planet, when we reached the grasslands, typically those areas became used for food production. Hence, the Midwest became, to a large extent, the breadbasket for America. As a result, there's now only 4 places worldwide that scientists have identified where intact temperate grasslands can still be conserved on a large landscape scale. There's still a lot of smaller ones, but in terms of large whole ecosystem conservation, you're looking at the last 4 here. 3 of those, as you can see, are overseas in Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Patagonia. And one is the Northern Great Plains, which extends from parts of Southern Canada into parts of the north section of the United States. It's here on the Northern Great Plains that American Prairie Reserve is working to create the largest wildlife reserve in America's lower 48 states, a refuge for wildlife, for public enjoyment, and a treasure set aside for future generations. To help get you oriented a bit, this is a map of Montana, and the area within the blue rectangle is the section of the Northern Great Plains where we are working to create the American Prairie Reserve. And as we go forward, Danny, Dr. Kinka, and Dr. Boyce will share a bit about what makes this region so special for conservation. The long-term vision is to assemble a landscape roughly 3.2 million acres in size, and then over time repopulate it with thriving numbers of wildlife, everything from bison to prairie dogs to grassland birds. In many ways, this project has been an undertaking that has been dreamed about and envisioned for more than a century. Historical documents from the times of Lewis and Clark, for example, reveal that there was a vast abundance of wildlife in this part of the United States. So when Lewis and Clark came down the Missouri in the early 1800s, they described the American Prairie Reserve region as being so thick with bison that when they ascended the cliffs on the edge of the Missouri River, it looked like the landscape was blanketed black and brown with animals. Other Western explorers, this is a painting by George Catlin, who was an artist and explorer who came west right around that time period. They documented with their paintbrush the incredible wildlife experience that they saw in this part of Montana. Catlin in particular was so amazed by what he saw here that he proposed creating what he called a nation's park. In a sense, perhaps one of the first thoughts given to creating a national park on Montana's Great Plains, which he described as a thrilling specimen for America to preserve and hold up to the view of her refined citizens and the world in future ages. In many ways, the project that we're undertaking today is bringing Catlin's vision to life. I'm now going to switch, or David, if you would switch spotlight to Dr. Danny Kinka. He'll share with us some of the history of the wildlife in this area and how it has changed over time.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for that, Michael. So, whoops, I'm always hitting the wrong buttons here. Just put this in presentation mode for you. So I have the kind of unfortunate job of telling y'all what happened, why Catlin's vision didn't come to be 150 years ago, why we need to talk about restoration and conservation of the plains as opposed to just protections. And it's not a particularly happy story, but I do think it's an important story to understand how we do what we do and the importance of prairie conservation to understand what happened to it in the first place. And so shortly, very shortly after George Catlin said that in 1841, I believe, we see about 50 years of kind of wholesale undoing of a very complicated, very diverse, very resilient ecology in the plains. It starts around the time of there's quite a bit of Indian wars going on at the time where the US government is subjugating the plains people of the interior of the continent. War, because knowing that one of the primary, their food source and a primary source of most of the resources, that was bison in the case of the plains tribes that lived in the northern central part of the continent. And so you see bison not only being overhunted for resource, hunted for sport, hunted as a tactic of war, and then hunted also as a resource for bison leather, things like that. Makes pretty good factory belts, apparently. At the same time, you've already seen at least 50 years of fur trading coming out of the interior of the continent. This ramps up. It leads to the almost whole-scale eradication of fur-bearing species like beaver and otter in the prairies, largely in the name of fashion. That's what the picture of these guys here with their beaver skin hats is all about. You also see shortly thereafter the start of a kind of open range cattle days, people making a go, so unsustainable grazing, people trying to make a go at farming in what is otherwise very desertified area. This is short grass prairie with very little precipitation. It doesn't make very good productive farm ground. And people find that out pretty fast. In fact, the Dust Bowl hits Montana about a decade before it hits places like Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma. And a lot of that soil is suitable for farming, at least at the time. And then shortly thereafter, particularly, you'll see when we put the maps back up again, that American Prairie Reserve was built around an enormous reservoir. Now that reservoir got us the largest wildlife refuge in the lower 48, the Charlie Russell National Wildlife Refuge. But the only reason it exists is because that river was dammed in the first place, largely as a reaction to this kind of early Dust Bowl effect that happens in central Montana. All of these factors together in one way or another lead to the kind of destabilization of the ecosystem and the wholesale removal of particularly large mammalian species on the plains. So let's break that down, kind of look at it one at a time. What I'm showing you here is around 1800. So Lewis and Clark show up in 1801 in Montana. So shortly, they're not the first settlers to make it out there, but this is largely pre-colonization, right? This is more or less a kind of relative example of what the large mammal community looks like in the plains region, right? You've got 3 large wild carnivores, people, of course, playing a fundamental role in the ecosystem, a series of mesocarnivores, so medium-bodied carnivores, a series of herb raising work, pre-domesticated cattle, and then small-bodied herbivore. and a beaver. And what we see moving from 1800 to 1885, remember Catlin's calling for the creation of a park in 1841, another 40 years later, you've seen the grizzly bear has now been completely eradicated from the plains. The grizzly bear is in fact a endemic plain species, even though they don't exist there today. This is an animal that evolved on the prairies, kind of built to live in the prairies, even more so than in the mountains. And you see the loss of bison. They're pretty much almost completely gone or at their historic minimum in around 1885. This is when you just have a small handful of remnant animals in what is today Yellowstone National Park, but completely gone from our area of the prairie. And then the beaver are almost completely trapped out as well. Advancing a little farther in time, again, going into those kind of Dust Bowl era, now we see all of the large carnivores that call the prairie home are eradicated, are extirpated from the prairie. These aren't extinct species, obviously, but they're no longer locally present. So the cougar, the wolf, the gray wolf, and the grizzly bear are all gone. And we've also lost the kind of endemic fox of the prairie, the swift fox, which I think Andy might talk a little bit about later, which is kind of killed off on accident almost, is a kind of byproduct for persecution of coyotes and gray wolves. Swift fox are tiny, they're the size of a house cat. They mostly eat insects, so they're not really hurting or getting in anybody, and they're primarily nocturnal, so they're not really getting in anybody's way. But targeted killing of other canid species, or the dog-like species, results in the eradication of the swift fox, becomes locally extinct, and almost oblivion. They're knocked back to near extirpation. The bison is completely gone, and then mule knocked back to very, very low levels, and the beaver is still doing poorly. Population of prairie dogs, but by 1950, we settlers of the prairie have learned how to, effectively remove these things at a whole scale level through poisoning campaigns. Again, persecution because of perceived competition for resources. People think that these things take grass out of the mouths of domestic cattle basically. And then also plague shows up in the North American continent, and around this time, the sylvatic plague, which the prairie dog has no natural resistance to being unregulated persecution, and this disease really knocks prairie dogs back to about 2% of their historic range, including on the region that we're sitting in. You also get some weird effects where the mule deer population actually rebounds around this time. But for the most part, and the black-footed ferret is now gone as well. Black-footed ferrets being probably the most endangered land mammal in North America. They subsist almost exclusively on prairie dogs. So without prairie dogs to support them, the black-footed ferret is actually believed to be extinct until the 80s, when there's a small population found in kind of central Wyoming. And this composition of species that you see here in 1950 is more or less what persists for the next 50 years, at least until the creation of an American Prairie Reserve and the arrival of some other NGOs in the area. So about 2000 is from 1950 to 2000, this is the composition of species that you'll see in the mammal community. To look at that another way, we can kind of zoom out from that area of central Montana that Michael showed you, and think about what's happening at a hemisphere or a continental scale. And you can see that for many of the species that I just mentioned and a couple others, we see massive, massive range contraction. So looking at just the amount of space that those species are taking up. I know the text is a little bit small in these slides, but basically with the American bison there, you can see they're almost completely driven to extinction. So, and that this map is as of today. So very, very little recovery in terms of ecosystem level recovery of the bison, despite being our national mammal. Black-footed ferrets, I don't know, maybe you can. I can't even see the dark green dots on that map. They're so knocked back that they essentially have no real, just you can measure it in, hundreds of acres, basically, maybe a couple thousand compared to the millions that they would have previously existed on. The grizzly bear, again, a plains endemic species, is driven exclusively into the mountains of the Northern Rocky Mountains, and sage-grouse, swift fox, and pronghorn all see pretty large reductions in their continental home ranges as well. If we look globally, we can see that what's happening in Montana or even in North America is not really unique, although I think it's probably happening at an exaggerated levels at the prairies. And again, Michael mentioned that there's less than 5% of prairies or grasslands globally are protected. But even if we just look at biodiversity, this is kind of vertebrate biodiversity. This is a fairly recent study that came out since 1970. So just in the last 50 years, 51 years, I guess now, we've seen a 60% reduction in vertebrate biomass or kind of a bioabundance across the globe. So not, again, total species loss, but just you can think of 2/3 of every mammal population just disappearing. Another way of looking at that, again, and this is globally, is kind of measuring the proportion of biomass. This is just mammals again, now, not vertebrate species like the previous slide, but if we just look at all of the mammals globally. In 1850, again, just shortly after Catlin was quoted as saying, calling for the creation of a prairie park, we estimate that about 85% of the total biomass of mammals was accounted for by wild mammals, with humans and livestock equaling only a remaining 15%. Again, so this is every giraffe, every blue whale, every hippopotamus, every bison, person, cow, pig, etc. If we fast forward to 2018, we see this massive, massive undoing of this mammal biodiversity, where now humans and livestock make up 94% of all mammalian biomass on the planet, with wild animals accounting for just the remaining 6%. And the projections are by 2030, it'll be down to 3% for wild animals. Again, this is everything that's not a human being or a mammalian livestock. So pigs, cows, goats, 3% for every other mammal on the planet. So what we're seeing locally is not unique at a global scale, but is certainly reflective as a microcosm of what's going on globally, and is potentially a more exacerbated version of that biodiversity loss, just centralized right here in North America in the United States. And so this is a painting I think about a lot. This is a painting called "When the Land Belonged to God." It's by Charlie Russell, Charles Russell, a famous Western artist, and the namesake of the kind of national wildlife refuge around which American Prairie Reserve is based, right? And so what I think Russell is trying to capture here in his painting, and that's the Missouri River, by the way, we can identify, we know where this kind of existed with his own eyes, but this is a real. And I think it's a depiction of that kind of like wild America, right? An American Serengeti, this just massive, this incredible natural history that was on display for anybody who was around to see it as recently as the 1850s, basically, right? Tons and tons of bison, but also things like wolves and sage grouse and elk and bighorn sheep, pronghorn, you name it. And if we fast forward to today, what you see is kind of, it's almost as if the subject matter of Russell's painting has been removed, right? The landscape remains. The land remains primarily untilled, although that is changing at an alarming rate. But the prairie, for the most part, is what we call it's right side up. It hasn't been tilled up for row cropping or agriculture, and so we have species composition in the grassland community that is largely intact. We have some weeds, but we're missing that mammalian biodiversity and biorichness, bioabundance that used to be there. We've kind of traded this indigenous biodiversity for a domesticated homogeneity. So not only did you trade 5 large-bodied herbivore species for a single domesticated one and removed all of the kind of commensurate predators that are associated with them and all the mesocarnivores carnivores associated with the system, or knocked them back to very, very low levels. But you're also managing those grasslands in a way that is very, very static and very, very homogeneous. And so I think Andy's going to talk about this a little bit more when we get to his talk, but you've not only removed all the mammal communities, but it's not just that the subject's gone, the kind of ecological work that community of species is doing is now missing from the prairie as well. And so instead of a diverse mixture, a mosaic-y habitat of structural diversity of the grassland, you have a very homogeneous kind of almost a monoculture of wild prairie in the sense of structural diversity, right? Everything's just kind of grazed at a nice even level, which ultimately results in less diversity of habitat, which results in less diversity, which results in less structural stability or less resilience of the ecosystem. And I think Andy's going to get into a lot more of the fun parts about how we put this back together. But before that, I'll hand this back to Michael, and he's going to talk to you about how we do the kind of first and most important mission, which is just stitching together enough land to make this restoration project viable. We need a very big space to get this done, and Michael's going to tell you how we do that.
Thank you, Danny. So, following the thread from George Catlin and his vision of a nation's park to the present, the American Prairie Reserve began in 2001. but it resulted from decades of scientific papers, conferences, and brainstorming put out by groups like World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, and others that really honed in on this section of the Northern Great Plains as being a unique conservation opportunity. During those early discussions with the various conservation groups and scientists who were looking at this issue of grassland conservation, the rough number of acres that was identified as being necessary to accommodate all of the historically present species and ecological processes necessary for a grassland to thrive was right around 3.2 million acres. Now, that's a large chunk of land. For the sake of comparison, when you think about 3.2 million acres, picture the state of Connecticut. That's about the size we're aiming for. Another way to think about it, if any of you have been to Yellowstone National Park, 3.2 million acres is about 1/3 larger than Yellowstone National Park. So clearly it's a lot of land. Now, how do we get there? Going back, this is similar to the map I shared in the beginning. And when we look at this region of the Northern Great Plains, there's a number of factors that really make it stand out for conservation. One of those Danny touched on, which is that about 95% of this area has never been broken for agriculture. Now, that's different from, say, the Midwest, where a lot of agricultural activity has taken place. And once ground is converted to crops, it becomes much harder to restore it. The other unique advantage we have, there's already 2 large conservation areas in the region. One of those is the Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge. So the painting that Danny shared, this is named for that artist. And this refuge is about 1.1 million acres. Next to it is the Upper Missouri Breaks National Monument, which you see on the left here. And that is, I believe, right around 370,000 acres. So we use those as our land anchors. And essentially what we're doing, if you imagine it like a jigsaw puzzle, we raise funds to purchase private land that can augment what's already here. Now this map becomes a bit more complex. This next layer that I added, and this is a key component of our strategy. All of this sort of light gray, light green shading that you see, that's public land that's largely managed by agencies like the Bureau of Land Management. Now, a majority of that is in what are called grazing leases. And what that means, and this was something I wasn't really familiar with until I started learning how land works in Montana. But when you purchase private land in this area, and this is true throughout the American West, these ranches come with leases in surrounding public land, which historically were attached to the private property. So if you're a cattle rancher, this gives you access to graze your cattle in the surrounding public lands. Now, the advantage of that is when American Prairie Reserve purchases private land, which is the dark shading that I just added onto the map, we also gain access to those grazing leases because we are a private landowner. So in that respect, even though we're not in the cattle grazing business, the way that we interact with those leases is very similar to a rancher buying land out here. We gain management influence over them. So through private land purchases, and each of these mixed light green, dark green regions is a section of the reserve, a section of the land that we own or lease. Through 31 purchases of land, we've accumulated roughly 419,000 acres. And of that, about 104.5 thousand is private land that we actually hold deed to. The remaining 315,000 or so is public land leased back from primarily the Bureau of Land Management. So we're well on our way. We've put together quite a bit of land, but we still have a long way to go. And in order to reach that 3.2 million acre goal, which includes, and this is important, it includes within that acreage the public lands that are already in this region. We need to accumulate right around 500,000 acres in private land that can then glue together the surrounding public lands to create a 3.2 million, give or take, acre landscape. This is a photo of our most recent acquisition. This is called the Blue Ridge region on the reserve. It's a really neat property. It's got a neat mixture of landscape types. And one reason this property was very attractive is there's a large resident elk population that's been habitating on that property for some time now. This one here is another shot of Blue Ridge. And the key thing here, I think, is that the strategy that we're using is in a lot of ways unique to how conservation has been historically undertaken. So when we think of the great national parks like Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, these were essentially done by government decree. And of course, if you study out that history, it's a lot more complex than that. But what we're doing is really, you could think of it as a public-private partnership. We're purchasing land on the free market from willing sellers, and then using that land to connect with public land that's already within the region to create the reserve. Before I move on to the next slide, I'd like to shift to Dr. Andy Boyce. And we'll have a Q&A at the end of this, so we can get into the land acquisition in greater detail if anyone would like to deep dive into that. But Dr. Boyce will talk with you about what do we do once we accumulate this land? What are some of the initiatives underway relating to wildlife, and how do we bring wildlife populations back to this area? How do we study and track the wildlife that are here? So I'm going to switch off my sharing, and Andy, you can go ahead and change to your screen.
All right, are you guys seeing a PowerPoint screen there?
Yep, we can see you.
Okay, great. Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. My name's Andy Boyce. I work for the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. As Danny and Michael told you before, I'm fortunate enough to get to do a bunch of my work out on the American Prairie Reserve. And really, my job is a little bit twofold. In one part, it's to go out to places like APR and to study the organisms that are out there and to document the changes in an ecosystem when we bring back native keystone species to the landscape. And it's also to use a place like APR as a natural laboratory to understand how those ecosystems work and interactions between the organisms there. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit today about grassland bird conservation in North America, trends, threats, solutions, and our ongoing work at the American Prairie Reserve. Danny and Michael, I think, both brought up that Smithsonian's work is not limited to birds out on APR. My talk tonight is going to focus on bird work because that's really where my focus is, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions you guys have on other portions of the work having to do with bison, prairie dog, swift fox, or anything in that realm. So first off, I'm going to use the word grassland birds a lot during this talk, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So when I talk about grassland birds, I'm talking about species that spend some portion of their life cycle, either the breeding season, migration, or wintering somewhere in the grasslands of the Great Plains of Canada, United States, and Mexico. I think a lot of times when we think about grassland birds, we think a lot about, the boring brown sparrows, right? Vesper sparrow, grasshopper sparrow. I guess I can't think of any other boring ones because I don't really consider them boring. But the truth is, grassland birds represent a massive diversity. We have sparrows, longspurs, pipits, the classic small songbirds that we think about a lot, but there's also quail. Snowy owls spend the winter on the Great Plains of North America. Greater and lesser prairie chickens are incredibly imperiled and are endemic to the Great Plains of North America. A lot of our shorebirds actually breed in the Great Plains. Long-billed curlews, birds that I think you folks in Southern California are probably really familiar with during the winter. A lot of those birds are spending their summers breeding up in our part of Montana. And I just want to call your attention to the map there. So I don't think I have a pointer, but hopefully I've done a good enough job with the slides. But the American Prairie Reserve is located in north central Montana. And this map, the sort of different shades of red on this map represent the relative species diversity of grassland birds in different regions. And as you can see there, APR is located right in the heart of the most diverse area of breeding birds anywhere on the northern Great Plains. So we'll start off with bad news and get into good news and interesting stuff further on. So I think we all know this is true, but grassland birds are in trouble. In Canada, they're in trouble. 57% decline in grassland birds, one of the most rapidly declining groups of birds in Canada as of 2019. The story is the same in the United States. Grassland birds are the most rapidly declining group of birds in the US. And in Mexico, the story is potentially even worse. This graph here shows that all grassland birds are declining. That's what we see in that other line. But grassland birds that winter in the Chihuahuan Desert of New Mexico are declining even faster than the rest. So this is really a continental scale problem that we need to solve. So what's going wrong? Danny and Michael, to some degree, touched on a lot of the large historical factors that have brought us to the place where we are right now. But I'm going to talk in more of a strictly ecological sense. Now it's easy for us, or it's easy for me working in north central Montana to forget some of the large scale stuff because I get to work in a place that looks like this. But one thing that is a ubiquitous problem across the grasslands is the loss of natural disturbances. So grasslands they're not like tropical forests. They aren't these stable, old ecosystems or mature forests of the East, or the sequoias of the Pacific coast, where they're very, very stable and they look the same year to year. Grasslands are dynamic and ever changing. And the reasons for that are sort of myriad. Bison used to range across the Great Plains in their millions, grazing certain areas, leaving other areas completely untouched, creating a mosaic of different grass heights. Prairie dogs used to cover vast, vast areas, tens of millions of acres in the northern Great Plains. And they dramatically change the areas that they live just by their grazing and their burrowing habits. Fire used to be way more prevalent in the grasslands of North America than it is now. Either natural fire set by lightning or fire used by Native Americans to do their own sort of version of land management. So this is why disturbance is important. Disturbance creates heterogeneity. It creates different habitat types within a given area. And in order to have a diversity of grassland birds, you need that heterogeneity. This is a classic figure by Knopf in 1996 that shows kind of the ecological or the vegetational niche of a variety of grassland birds. In areas of extremely short grass that have undergone really, really heavy grazing, species like mountain plover, McCown's longspur, ferruginous hawk really, really do well. In moderate areas, we have sort of tall grass and shrub specialists like lark bunting in high abundance. And in areas where we've had very little grazing over multiple years, we start to see species like Sprague's pipit, Baird sparrow, and Vesper sparrow that really require that tall, dense grass and shrubs. So this is really one of the most spectacular things about working at the American Prairie Reserve. We get to work in a natural lab where the folks at APR are spending a lot of time, money, and energy to bring these natural disturbances back to the ecosystem. And I think the most obvious one that we all think about are bison. These guys have told you about it already, but one of APR's major restoration goals is bringing back bison to the North American grasslands at an ecologically relevant scale. So that means, hundreds, thousands of animals at really, really big pastures. A second type of disturbance that APR is maybe not necessarily bringing back, but promoting on the lands that they own and manage. Prairie dogs are persecuted across the northern Great Plains, shot, poisoned, They're just generally not tolerated in most agricultural areas. APR is doing a lot of work to encourage the growth of prairie dog colonies, and we get to be, we're quite fortunate to be able to study grassland bird communities in this context. So I talk a lot about keystone species in this talk, and when I talk about keystone species, I'm generally referring to those two animals, bison and prairie dogs. The keystone species are important because they have dramatic impacts on biodiversity, disproportionate to their biomass in the ecosystem. These are just two examples here. So these are two camera trap shots actually from a prairie dog town. And you might notice here, there's two birds that are endemic to the northern Great Plains. They only breed there, and they're really highly dependent on prairie dog towns. On the left here, we have a ferruginous hawk. They're a specialist prairie dog predator. They oftentimes will just walk on the ground in prairie dog colonies, waiting for an opportunity to take a prairie dog. And on the right, you see a prairie dog on the left and a mountain plover all the way on the right next to the burrow. Mountain plovers specialize on extremely short grass areas, and those are often found in the vicinity of prairie dog towns. So we'll start in with the actual science that me and my colleagues are doing out in north central Montana. This is the major thing that motivates us. Temperate grasslands and the species that depend on them are severely imperiled. It's not just that they're declining rapidly, but they're declining rapidly, and we have hardly any of them protected. I think Danny and Michael spoke about this already. And opportunities to study the effects of keystone species on whole ecosystems in temperate grasslands are very rare and very valuable. So the first question I'm going to tackle here and tell you a little bit about how we tested and what our results were. Does bison reintroduction result in changes to grassland bird communities? A relatively simple question. So starting off, we have reasons to believe that bison, may have a strong impact on grassland bird communities. Bison and cattle differ dramatically in their behavior, their physiology, and their habitat preferences. And I want to point out also that these two animals also differ, in our region at least, in the way that they're managed. APR tries to run bison on the largest pastures possible. They remove as much interior fencing from these pastures as they possibly can, leaving only a strong exterior fence. These animals are also left on the landscape for 12 months. They're not fed hay in the winter. They're not taken off the landscape in the winter. They're not moved around in any sort of manipulative way. They're just left to graze as they will. Cattle are the exact opposite. Cattle in this area of north central Montana are grazed in a way called it's called deferred rotation, which it doesn't necessarily, it's not an important term, but what it means is that cattle are moved sequentially, across multiple pastures over the course of the year, and then during the winter they're brought off the range entirely. So, two animals relatively similar in appearance, but with major differences in their ecology and in the way that they're managed. So we went out there and tested, do these differences impact biodiversity in grassland birds? We did this by first splitting up the prairie into two distinct ecosystems, which are pretty obvious when they're out there. The first are grassland birds that live in the upland grasslands or sagebrush steppe. This is what we think of. This is like the first thing that comes to mind when we think about grasslands. The second ecosystem are riparian ecosystems. And these are everything from the massive Missouri River that flows through the center of the APR region to small ephemeral streams that sort of wind their way through the prairies. We've got a Baltimore oriole here. This is a bird that breeds right outside my field house. Just a little tidbit, because I think we probably have birders in the room. This area is really, really cool because we actually have 3 different species of orioles that breed within right on the property where I stay. Baltimore oriole, Bullock's oriole, and an orchard oriole. It's a really cool little spot where the ranges of all those species come together. And this is, of course, a mountain plover on the left. Oh, did I freeze? Okay, now here we go. Yeah, so this is how we go out and do our work. This is old-fashioned ecology, nothing terribly fancy or high-tech about it. We go out to these areas. We have hundreds, over 250 sites actually. We go out there with a team of interns and technicians, count the birds, we identify them each to species, and then we measure vegetation conditions at each site. field work in Montana is a challenge, but it's also fun. This is just a quick collage of some of the challenges we encounter in our field work out on the prairie. Just ridiculous and impassable mud. We do a lot of work with camera traps, and what you see on the right here is the result of a camera trap meeting a bison on one of APR's management units. So it's a lot of fun, but this work is not without challenges. So this is a map of our study sites, over 250 locations in grassland and riparian ecosystems, and we surveyed these over the course of 3 years, 2018, 2019, and 2020. The first results I'll touch on are our grassland birds, the birds of the uplands. So this was interesting, and in some ways a little bit of a surprising result. We found that by any measure of diversity that we used, either species richness, or something called Shannon's Diversity Index, which takes into account abundance and the traits of different birds. We found that diversity of grassland birds was similar between bison pastures and cattle pastures. And we dug a little deeper and we looked at species-specific differences. So how do individual bird species respond to bison pastures versus cattle pastures? And as we would expect, based on the results I just showed you, it's a little bit all over the map. Species like lark sparrow, which specializes on bare ground, significantly more common in cattle plots. Species like grasshopper sparrow, Sprague's pipit, which are dependent on tall, dense grass, a little more common in the bison plots. So what is the takeaway from this? Well, I think there are several takeaways. The first is that this rest rotation cattle grazing is actually doing quite a good job of providing diverse grassland bird habitat in north central Montana. Second is year-round continuous grazing of bison with no pasture rotation also provides exceptionally good habitat for grassland birds. And I think one of the more subtle takeaways from this is that because bison require fewer fences and less human intervention, they actually have, even if there's the same amount of grassland bird species on the landscape, the removal of that fencing and human influence actually creates other benefits for grassland ecosystems. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to touch on here is that, I think maybe it's just me, but before I started working in Montana, I heard a lot about, the evils of cattle grazing and the tremendous negative effects it had on the ecosystem. And while cattle grazing does have some challenges regarding biodiversity that I'll touch on later, in this ecosystem, it's substantially better than removing grazers from the system entirely. And this is basically a diagram of what happens when you remove grazers from grasslands entirely. You don't have this diverse heterogeneous system. Everywhere in the landscape basically eventually transitions to this tall grass, mixed shrub habitat where only a few species can be found. So this was sort of a secondary finding of our work. So moving on to riparian systems, and I'm going to do this super briefly because we have a lot more to get to tonight. But the long and short of it is that riparian systems are incredibly important for the birds of grasslands, not only for breeding birds like the orioles that I talked about previously, but even for birds that are migrating between South America and the boreal forest. So this is just a quick collage of some of the migrant species that I've seen in riparian systems across APR. And I think these are probably not the birds that you think of when you think of Montana. We've got a black-polled warbler, northern water thrush, black-throated blue warbler, blue-headed and Cassin's vireos, and yellow-breasted chat. And these riparian systems that are extremely rich in insect life are critically important to these migrants as they make their journeys across the grasslands. So we'll move straight to results on the right side of the slide. What we found were in areas grazed by bison, in comparison to cattle, we found taller woody vegetation, increased abundance and density of willows, which are a critically important plant for a lot of riparian birds. And this led to increased bird biodiversity on bison plots compared with cattle plots. So taking all these results together, grasslands, riparian areas, this is basically the take-home message. And I'll settle on this for a little bit because it's a little bit of a complex figure. We have riparian bird diversity on the y-axis, increasing diversity as we go up. Grassland bird biodiversity on the x-axis, increasing diversity as we move to the right. And these are sort of the different types of management that occur in north central Montana. We have some areas with no grazers, that's in the upper left-hand quarter. We see quite high riparian bird biodiversity, but low grassland bird diversity because of the absence of that disturbance from grazers. On the bottom right, we have areas grazed by cattle. We have quite high grassland bird diversity, again, because of the disturbance and the creation of heterogeneity of different type of grassland habitat. But cattle have a really, really strong negative effect on riparian vegetation because they're very, very tied to wet areas. We see lower riparian bird diversity in cattle plots. And bison, as you would expect of an animal that co-evolved in this ecosystem, is really the best of both worlds. In areas where bison are allowed to graze 12 months a year in large pastures, we see high grassland bird biodiversity and high riparian bird biodiversity. So I mentioned before that, in addition to just looking purely at bird biodiversity on different plots, there was an added advantage grazing bison in the way that APR does. They remove a lot of fences from the landscape because they don't need to be rotated around a landscape like cattle do. And fence mortality animals dying by colliding with fences is a major issue in the northern Great Plains. Pronghorn, these are animals that didn't evolve having to jump over anything. They live in these huge flat landscapes. Many of these animals die or are sort of rerouted off their migration routes by the presence of fences. Sage grouse on the right, large, low-flying animals. They're not used to fences. They don't see them when they're moving between their leks and foraging grounds, and they suffer really high mortality in areas with dense fences. So, being able to reduce the number of miles of fence in these areas that are grazed by bison has major positive effects for species like these. This is a diagram of the area, the sort of northern portion of the APR region, and all these different squiggles on here. It's not important that you look super closely at all of them, but these are the migratory routes of pronghorn and sage grouse in this region. So when I tell you that removing fences in this landscape is important, this is why. Between summer and winter, these animals are moving 500, 1,000 miles between their summer and wintering grounds. And if we can remove, a large proportion of the fences from that region, we make that trip much safer and much easier for these migratory animals. Okay, so speaking about migration, I just want to touch relatively quickly on another aspect of our work. Our work is based on the American Prairie Reserve, but because a lot of the birds that we study are migratory, we also study the movement of animals across their entire life cycle. So this is a project that I'm tremendously excited about and that we've been working on for a couple years. Long-billed curlew movement ecology. Over 2019 and 2020, we deployed 27 GPS tags on long-billed curlews. This is a photo here of a curlew carrying one of our GPS tags. These things are, they're amazing pieces of technology. They're GPS, they're accelerometers, temperature sensors, humidity sensors, and they're all packed into a package that's about 12 grams. That's less than 2% of the body mass of these curlews. And we're really careful about the amount of weight that we put on these birds because we don't want to have any negative effect on their ability to move and their ability to survive over multiple years. We started off our interest in curlews because they're fairly unique among grassland birds. They don't just have one vegetation type that they key in on for the entirety of the breeding cycle. Between feeding, nesting, and brood rearing, they require areas with short grass, medium grass, and really tall grass at the same time. So we were really interested to see in very fine detail using these GPS tags, how do curlews move around this landscape, especially in the presence of prairie dogs and bison, to sort of find all these different categories of vegetation they need across the breeding season. And I already mentioned here, APR is doing a tremendous job of bringing bison and promoting prairie dogs on this landscape. So we have a lot of large prairie dog towns to do this work on. And these are some of our preliminary results. So each one of these push pins is a location, a long-billed curlew GPS location from our tagged birds. And these sort of opaque white polygons are active black-tailed prairie dog towns. What you can see here is that, the movement of these birds, the foraging of these long-billed curlews is really, really focused on active black-tailed prairie dog towns, which was a bit of a surprise to us. We didn't realize that these areas were so important foraging areas for long-billed curlews. This has been a really, really cool finding. But I also want to highlight that this work isn't just about how these birds live and behave on the breeding grounds. These sort of pink dots represent full year tracks of our tagged long-billed curlews. These animals are sending us GPS locations about every 30 minutes with extremely high accuracy. So we're able to visualize, their movements across the entire annual cycle. So we study these birds up in Montana on the breeding grounds. This information also allows us to key in and try to conserve key migration and stopover areas. And what we found is that there's this area in northern Texas, northeastern New Mexico, where almost all of our curlews stop for between 2 weeks and 4 months during their southbound migration in the fall. And without the information that we're getting from these tags, we wouldn't know that that's such a critical area for them, and we wouldn't be able to target conservation action to that area. On the wintering grounds, our birds spend time both on the Gulf Coast near the Texas-Mexico border and in the Chihuahuan Desert of Mexico. And something really cool that came out of our collaboration that we formed this year was with a conservation NGO down in the Chihuahuan Desert, where we're able to send those folks the GPS locations of our curlews so that we let the curlews show them, where the critical water resources are in the Chihuahuan Desert. And then those folks on the ground are able to go out to those areas, interact with local government officials, ranchers, and make sure those water resources are available to the curlews throughout the winter season. And that's all I have for you guys, and I'll kick it back to Michael and Danny. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. That really brought everything together. And it's so fun hearing both you and Danny talk because I learn something new every time. I want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A. So I'm going to move through these next few slides pretty quickly. If something jumps out and gets your attention, we'll talk about that during the Q&A session. So in brief, humans have been part of the landscape as well for thousands of years. And of course, the Native American cultures have a really long and rich heritage on the Great Plains. Today, humans continue to be an important part of the American Prairie Reserve project and landscape. And we seek to honor the history that is there and present on the land that we accumulate. So what you're looking at here, this is actually a teepee ring left by one of the tribes. And when we find things like this, we seek to preserve them and to honor the cultural heritage that they represent. We're also open to the public. So the American Prairie Reserve is a place that welcomes visitors. We have a variety of ways to come and experience the prairie. We have 2 public campgrounds for tents and RV camping. We also have what we call our huts, and this is one that you're looking at here. These are yurts, really nice facilities for family camping or anyone looking to explore the landscape. We have a program that Danny can speak a little bit more to during Q&A called Wild Sky Ranching. And in short, what this is we partner with willing ranchers who neighbor the reserve. And the program rewards those ranchers for implementing wildlife-friendly practices on their land. As one example, Andy shared with you the fence mortality slide, which was, I have to admit, pretty sad to look at. Barbed wire is one of the biggest issues in terms of fragmentation in the American West. And so as one example of something that wild sky ranchers can be rewarded for is installing wildlife-friendly fencing, which allows those animals to safely pass through. Just for fun, I couldn't resist sharing these. They're among my favorites. These are 2 photos taken on, actually should mention this couple here. Their names are Dave and Ronnie Crosco. They're wild sky ranchers from the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. And these photos were captured by camera traps that they've allowed us to put up on their property. You see the bear on the top one looks like he's almost smiling for the camera. The mountain lion is, I like to say, being a typical cat. It's got its tail turned to the camera, paying no attention to it. But this is just an example of some of the great results we're seeing from this program. We also have a number of educational outreach initiatives. This is our most recent, the American Prairie Field School. Due to COVID, I think it's taken a little bit of a different form than we initially imagined, but this is Dr. Kinka taking the prairie directly into Montana classrooms and educating up and coming generations about the importance of this incredible treasure that we have here in our backyards. And then lastly, this summer, we're really excited to open our first National Discovery Center. This will be a facility in a town called Lewistown, Montana, that is really the gateway community to the reserve. And its purpose is to inspire, to educate, to introduce visitors to what they're going to see when they go up to explore the landscape. And it's also a place to facilitate collaborations with groups like Smithsonian. And then lastly, in a lot of ways, this project is people driven. It's people from all walks of life coming together to celebrate and conserve this part of America's and the planet's natural heritage. And so there's a variety of ways that you can get involved. That ranges from contributing to American Prairie Reserve or to the Smithsonian Institute. Visiting, of course, is a great way to get your boots on the ground. We've hosted Audubon birding groups many times before, field trips, and travel I know is kind of touch and go right now due to the pandemic, but once things start to return to normal, we would love to see you, any of you, as a group up on the reserve. And I'll leave this up, and maybe David can share this with the group. These are ways to get in touch with us. And if you'd like to learn more, at the top there, we have the Smithsonian's website highlighting the work that they're doing. And the website on the bottom is the American Prairie Reserve website. Andy, I know you had a few thoughts you wanted to share as well.
Oh yeah, just really to echo what Michael has said. I think we at the Smithsonian are really excited to be part of this partnership, and we see a really bright future ahead in terms of learning about and conserving organisms. Hope you follow along with us. That means getting involved by visiting the website, by donating, any of that sort of thing. We really love to have you have your attention.
Absolutely. Well, David, I think we'll pause there. If we have time left, we would certainly love to welcome some questions, have some dialogue or discussion. We can take it in whatever direction works best for you, but we always love to have a conversation after a talk like this.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much, Michael and Andy and Daniel. That was a wonderful presentation. I do appreciate that. So if there are any questions, you can unmute yourself and please ask away.
Michael, I have a question.